All right, so let's talk anabolic hormones. First and foremost, what does that mean? So an anabolic steroid or hormone is basically a cholesterol-derived steroid that engages the androgen receptor and initiates growth, right? That's the big 10,000 foot view of what an anabolic hormone does. Obviously, things like growth hormone and IGF-1 are anabolic, but they don't do the same thing as the testosterone-derived anabolic hormones do. So to contextualize, we're going to be talking about sex steroid anabolic hormones. We're going to push off the IGF-1 and the growth hormone-related hormones to the side. So we're going to start off basically by walking through the mechanisms by which the anabolic hormones work. And if you're unfamiliar with the general flow of how a hormone works, it's released by an organ, tissue, right? Like so the testes, for example, or the ovaries, for example. And the hormone will circulate in the blood and float around, bind the different hormones or different proteins that carry it to its tissue of destination. And the hormone will pop off, bind to its receptor, and initiate a transduction of events, right? Whether that's going to be immediate with second messenger signaling systems or genomic systems. There's various different time scales that these hormones will work on, and that will ultimately affect what it's going to do in the long term. So as we move forward, when we talk about things like muscle protein synthesis and bone density or cognition or personality changes, all of those will be dependent on how the hormones are acting in concert over time, but also with the very initial presentation of the hormone to its receptor. One of the best examples of this is with puberty, right? So you have an adolescent that's going through these early stages of life, and all of a sudden, either in the female sense of menarche or the onset of menses, or the puberty of a male going through testicular descent and the exposure of testosterone and all those different things. So the first organ that we're going to stop on is the brain. One of the most contentious topics with hormone replacement is the effects of testosterone and the other androgens on the brain, mostly because of concepts like roid rage or personality changes, aggression, and violence on males. Well, to put that to rest, first and foremost, a lot of that data comes from the bodybuilding communities or the communities that tend to abuse or misuse a whole slew of performance-enhancing drugs. So it's almost impossible to use that data and to extrapolate what's going to happen if someone were to inject testosterone or to use a physiological replacement. That being said, in clinical practice, right, what we tend to see is actually where testosterone is going to benefit the stability of an organism, or in our cases, humans, right? But the benefit of the organism overall in how they can handle stress and how they can promote their reproductive fitness. Because that's what it all boils back down to. What is the purpose of reproductive hormones? Well, in the grand scheme of things, it's to promote the survival and the reproductive fitness of that organism. So when we look at the type of personality or the mentation of someone who is going to have success in the long term, it's going to be someone who is confident, someone who can have the appropriate concepts of winning, not just in one setting, but across a whole series of different games. And that's really what testosterone seems to do when it is in the physiologic concentrations it should be in. It kind of sets someone in the appropriate stage as far as where they are in a social hierarchy, how they can perceive themselves in relation to other dominant figures within that hierarchy, where they can fit themselves in from the competence perspective. And it helps them to really engage where they can and to step back where they're going to be beat. So to summarize, the effects of androgens or testosterone on the brain is really to stabilize hierarchical position, to promote confidence, and to promote to some degree disagreeableness. Now that doesn't mean that someone's just going to be an asshole. It typically means that if there's something that bothers somebody, they will have a higher proclivity to actually bring it up and not let it go under the rug to then fester and brew and to turn into something way bigger than it needs to be later on down the road. This is actually a funny clinical anecdote where most women that I tend to put on testosterone either for hormone replacement or for libido or some other symptom or complaint is that they will ultimately be a little bit more disagreeable. And spouses tend not to like that as much because, where they have had a passive, compliant individual alongside them, they all of a sudden kind of find their voice. We joke and say they kind of find their throat chakra, where they're essentially bringing up all these things that might have gone under the rug and otherwise been uncontested, and they contest. But ultimately what it does is it provides ground for that relationship to actually flourish more because they're not just getting walked over, right? They're presenting an argument. They're presenting themselves in a way that's actually combative in the sense that they can grow together and move past something rather than just get stuck behind a steadily building wall of shit. The next demographic of benefit that we can extrapolate from the literature for brain health and testosterone use, or at least its physiological replacement, is in the setting of neurodegeneration. So there's no study out there that's going to show that testosterone reduces your risk for dementia or Alzheimer's or any of that. But what we can say is that with the response of mitochondria, the organelles that generate energy and a whole host of other things within cells, especially neurons, with the estrogen-related receptors and dynamics of testosterone turning into estrogen in the brain, it would be impossible to say, especially with the association of menopause and andropause with the onset of dementia, and since those neurodegenerative conditions happen after the withdrawal of hormones, generally speaking, in older years, that there's something to do with energy dynamics and the transition of a healthy brain that cognates well into an unhealthy brain that does not cognate well. So in terms of what we do with precision medicine and trying to mitigate the four horsemen, right? Cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative disease, musculoskeletal injury, and cancer, the promotion of cognitive processes and critical thought and the ability to utilize blood sugar and fatty acids to run the engine that is your brain, it depends heavily on the availability of sex hormones. So while that synopsis was not comprehensive in any sense of the word, it's a brief introduction to the effects of anabolic hormones and testosterone in particular on the brain, we're going to move on to our next tissue of interest, which is the bone. Now, this is one tissue that's kind of hands down heavily associated with the levels of testosterone and estrogen in the body. There's no risk in saying that if you do not have enough testosterone or estradiol, that your bones will degenerate and lose their density. Now, whether or not this is more of an estrogen thing or a testosterone thing is pretty well played out also, but it's somewhat of a moot point anyway, because testosterone has to go to the tissue of interest, which is the bone, and be aromatized into estrogen locally in order to exert its effect. In the interest of longevity and promoting health span, avoiding hip fractures and avoiding osteoporosis and osteopenia is at the top of the priority list, right? So if we can make sure that someone's skeletal system is going to maintain its integrity over their lifespan, we're going to do it, right? So that's one of the most important things that we can really lean on when it comes to hormone replacement and using anabolic hormones to do so without much pushback from there not being enough evidence to show that that's the case. All right, so the next tissue of interest is the skeletal muscle. Obviously, when people think about hormone replacement and using testosterone and anabolic steroids, the skeletal muscle is at the forefront of the thought. So obviously, using testosterone is going to increase muscle mass, muscle density, strength, and all that kind of stuff. How does it do it? Well, like we talked about earlier, as far as the androgens binding the androgen receptor, instigating muscle protein synthesis, nitrogen retention, and the blockade of the catabolic signal from cortisol and basically inactivity, one of the strategies that we employ when using testosterone, especially from an opportunity cost, is that a lot of individuals just don't have time to do what they know they need to do as far as exercise and maintaining their physique the way they want it to because of time, right? And so with our society and culture set up the way it is to value success and business and everything else, that kind of takes us away from the modalities that will improve our lifespan and health span otherwise, it doesn't make sense to not use a tool that has such profound impact on that system just because we can't make the time to do what we need to do. Now, it doesn't excuse that either, but it's a nuanced conversation to have. The other benefits of using testosterone, or at least ensuring that the anabolic hormone levels in an individual are optimal, is the impact on metabolism in the muscle tissue. And so this is where upregulating different enzymes that take fatty acid through their metabolism and the transport of insulin receptors onto the muscle tissue to dispose of glucose and increase glycogen deposition. All of those physiologic parameters will definitely improve on anabolic hormone replacement and testosterone replacement, and is one of the benefits of using those tools. Now, when it comes to the heart, it's a little bit of a different story, right? So most of the data that we get for issues with cardiac contractility and ventricular hypertrophy are again from the populations that didn't exactly do it the right way. Who knows what they were using, when they were using it, how much they were using it, what their post-cycle therapy looked like. I mean, there's just too many variables to take the data from the misuse and abuse communities and translate that into clinical practice. Now, that doesn't mean that we can avoid it either, right? So if there's a signal within the replacement literature that says it would behoove us to make sure that when we use these tools that things don't go awry, that we pay attention to those signals, right? And so that's why, doing a yearly echocardiogram, or doing our blood work and doing the anthropometrics and doing our blood pressure, making sure the hematocrit's not too high, making sure that the blood's not getting too thick. All these different things add up to why we do what we do and how we make sure that it's safe.